This broadcast brought to you by Alltech, naturally.
So, can agriculture save the planet before it destroys it? Where will you be in 2050? I know where I'll be, I think. I'll be about 40 years older, around 90. And I'll be sitting in a restaurant, and my son will be saying to the waitress, "Is that chicken free range? Is it local? How local is it? And what's its name?" And my grandson, hopefully, one day will be looking and say, "Dad, that is so old school." So I don't know where we're going in terms of what's the next trend. But I do know that now is the time to get it right in agriculture. And now matters more than any other time. And we have a unique opportunity to connect with millennials on things that they care about. Climate change, for example, the environment. Vance? How many of you have heard of peak oil? Anyone? It's that concept where we've gotten about all we can out of oil and now we're on the slope of diminishing returns. Well, I don't know if we're at peak oil, but I do know we're at peak child. Peak child is a concept based on data by a statistician named Dr. Rosling. Now, what Dr. Rosling has found is that, and hold on now, there will never be more children in the world than there are now. Let me say that again. There will never be more children in the world than now. How can that be? Because we know we're having a rising population. How does this fit together and how does it fit with agriculture? Well, Dr. Rosling explains that over time, the population has been pretty steady. And then when he looked in the data and he saw that big rise, he started to look at what was going on there. Think back in the time when it's 1000 BC. How many children may live to adulthood? Think back to the 1600s. How many children may live? You have 8 kids, maybe 4 live. That's painful. That's too much. I want to ensure that my kids live on. Come back to the turn of the century, maybe 1 child dies. That's still too much. So people were not going to have less children. But what he discovered is that slowly now, as all around the world, people have increased their economic prosperity. They increased their ability for their children to survive through better maternal health and other ways, better diet, that all around the world, people are now having less children. 2.2 kids on average. 2.2 kids. In Bangladesh, they're having 2.2 kids. In countries in Africa, 2.2 kids on average. And this is very dramatic when you think about where we're going in terms of population growth. So that line across is the 2.2 kids. We're at 7 billion now, and we're going to go to 9 billion by 2050. And the way Dr. Rosling explains this is you have that base of children, but they're going to get older. These millennials are going to grow older. And so all the increase in population today is not due to having bigger families, but because people are able to live longer. And it's interesting. If you think about it, people make good choices, right? People are smart. I think that's what Andy said earlier, and it's true. We're going to make it in our best interest. If I know my children are going to live, I'm going to have less children because I can do better for them. So all of this relates to agriculture because right now, for those of us that are in agriculture, we know that these productivity gains have allowed us to produce more with less, be able to have better impact on the environment. But all of this right now has to feed that growing swell of population as it goes older. After 2050, it won't matter, because if we don't make the difference now with the environment, after 2050, it'll be too late. In other words, now is the time to change the planet to what we want it to be with agriculture. Why does the State Department even care about agriculture? Why do we have a group of people that deal with agriculture? Because we know now it's not only an economic security, it's a food security. Who remembers 2008 food price crisis? You know, when it jumped up, it was extremely dramatic. That led to riots around the world. So we know it's also a security issue. Let me give you just a broad perspective of how we view agriculture around the world. We see that it's 40% of the land base, the size of South America and Africa together. It uses 70% of the fresh water used. Here's over time the aerial sea shrinking. So it has a huge impact on the environment. It uses 30%, it produces 30% of the greenhouse gases. So it has a role to play in climate change, right? This is pretty sizable. This is bigger than the energy sector. This is agriculture, talking about forestry and ag combined. Bigger than the energy sector, which has been estimated around 25%. Now that energy sector will expand, but right now agriculture is bigger. I talked about population growth. So as those millennials grow older and as that population swells to its peak in about 2050, we're going to need a lot more food. And to get your head around that number of 9 billion, that's about adding the size of the population in Germany every year. So it's a huge, huge difference. And yet we all need to eat, and yet almost 1 billion don't have enough food today. 1 billion don't have enough food today. It's a hard number to wrap your head around. We talked about millennials caring about causes. There's a disconnect here with food. If you look at the causes of people dying versus hunger to others, that orange area, that's hunger and malnutrition of 9 million deaths per year compared to some other things. So it's making that connection of agriculture to the larger global picture, to the larger causes that are important. To reach 2050, the FAO estimates we will need 60% more food. We need to do it during less land, less water, less fertilizer, fewer pesticides. We need technology. Those in agriculture know what technology has done. I think about the generation I come from and the space age. You know, how many of you remember Tang and the squeezing of the tube and you can get this food item out and gee whiz, isn't that cool? We'll travel now to a generation, they weren't part of that space age. And they have a mistrust of science. They hear high-fat diet is bad. Now maybe it's not the high-fat diet. The scientists chose, very selective of the data. High sugar is bad. So they hear all this and they think, who am I to trust? So they have a disconnect and don't look at science in the same way, I think, as past generations. They don't understand that the scientific process is constantly moving toward convergence and hearing all those voices. Because they're hearing all the voices in the media. How do you discern? But we have a good story to tell in agriculture. In the past, between 1980 and 2011, in the time of the millennials, we've been able to use technology. That's genetic engineering, that's advanced breeding, that's things like precision farming to use almost half as much land, more than half the amount of erosion, half the water, less energy, and less greenhouse gases. These are things that millennials care about, but might not connect with agriculture and the technology needed. Right? When they hear a particular, right now, if you talk about genetic engineering, well, they don't call it that, they call it GMOs. And automatically, it's a different conversation. They don't make the connection to things they care about. And that's part of that disconnect. When we look at genetically engineered crops around the world, the adoption has been 100-fold. More developing countries than developed. And it's mostly resource-poor farmers. That's not what you hear if you were, for example, just to Google GMO or listen to the debate. You don't hear about the widespread adoption globally. That red line is the adoption in developing countries. And you'll notice in here, in Africa, there's not as many green countries that have adopted as well as in Europe. There's a connection there. Europe is a former colonial power in many of those countries. There's a connection, and there's messaging that's being shared, that's reverberating around the world. Here's a really good example of social media, the internet, and this global issue in agriculture. There was a study out by a gentleman named Seralini. Has anyone heard of that study on genetically engineering? That it causes, somebody in the back, that causes tumor in rats. Well, when he put the study out, he said, I'll give you this story to news outlets, but you can't talk to anyone else. And for 2 weeks. So it went out around the world, and when people started looking at the study, scientists started saying, you only use rats that get cancer. Almost all the rats got cancer. There's something wrong with this study. And so it was rejected by the European Food Safety Authority, by France, but not before Kenya saw it and was using this technology to advance forward in things like drought-resistant corn, stopped altogether and put a ban on it. This isn't science. But this is perception. And earlier somebody talked about the importance of perception. In countries like Bangladesh, some countries are moving forward. In countries like Bangladesh, BT eggplant, it's a genetically engineered eggplant with the same thing as we use in BT cotton, which is Bacillus thuringiensis. It allows you to not to have to spray pesticides. This is an important crop where it's 25% of the vegetable area, 50% of the hectares, and has a significant yield loss. It has a lot of pesticide sprays. So this is another good news story in agriculture because they're going to get yield gains because it has less loss due to pest pressure. India, right next door, this has been languishing for years. Why? Part of it is the messaging that's being given through through the internet, through social media, through different lines of communication, not based on fact, but perception drives policy. And policy then affects what's available, not just abroad, but here in the U.S. Some of our technologies we have to hold back because we know we're exporting to a particular country, and we don't want to have a export problem where billions of dollars are going to be at a port, sitting in a port, billions of dollars of product. So we're interconnected, and perception is driving agriculture in ways never before. Here's another example from the animal world of GE goats. These goats are genetically engineered to have increased lysozyme. This is also going on in Argentina, and this is to help with diarrheal diseases. It's the same ingredient, lysozyme, that's in human breast milk that conveys that anti-diarrheal property to babies. So there's a vast amount of work that's going on, but that story isn't out there. We have competing world views that are driving the conversation and allowing technology to either flourish or hold back. I want to talk about why that might be a little bit. When I used to work in Oklahoma and Kentucky, we knew that that the children of farmers were moving to urban areas, that there was this migration. When I got to the State Department, I began to see this is a global trend. This just isn't in the U.S. Here's in the 1950s a picture of the world, and the areas, the dark pink being the area that's the most urban. And watch it change over time as that area grows to where we are today. We have increasingly urban populations to where we might be in the future. So this has an effect because you have that disconnect. Yet I hear very clearly in the voices of the people we work with around the world and here in the U.S. a desire to connect. The idea millennials are foodies, and yet they might not have been raised on the farm. There's part of that disconnect. So all of this drives different choices on a personal level and then also on a country level. Go back to 1960, the beginning of the Green Revolution. All of the countries are more or less the same in terms of ag production. This is, on one side, you'll have the bottom is the time, and the other axis is net ag production. Watch it, how it changes. You have, as people have adopted different technologies, you'll have, because they have to, because they're dealing with this population swell, China, being able to increase productivity. India, Brazil. This is an interesting story of choices by governments. In the EU, they're growing by 4%. The U.S. in terms of ag production, the U.S. is growing by 20% and Brazil by 40%. Brazil is a huge adopter of technology, genetic engineering, and other types of technology in ag. They're very focused on that, and look where they'll be in 2019. So innovation matters, but public perception can drive this, right? Public perception is reality. We have different voices all around the world, right? And this matters. We're having two conversations. We're having the science conversation on one side, and then we're having a value conversation, and the two are not intersecting. Let's look at the old school risk. Old school risk is we have a hazard times exposure equals risk. But now we have all kinds of disruptive technologies. When I say a disruptive technology, I don't mean like the automobile. The automobile in itself wasn't a disruptive technology that made a change. What made it disruptive is when it could be mass-produced. So the internet is not so much the disruptive technology, it's all the connections that have now exploded. They've allowed countries to do revolutions, and they've allowed people who want to connect, I think, with food and agriculture to connect in their own way. So now we have a new school of risk. We have hazard times media exposure equals the perception of risk. Perception of risk is reality. So now we have it's the tweetification of risk. is our new reality. I talked about the disconnect and the longing to connect to agriculture. If you look at this package, it's a beautiful picture of a farm on the cover. But by the way, this is dog food. And we have health scares versus scary but healthy. You know, health scares, salmonella and chicken or in some other products, real health scares versus, you know, something like genetic engineering, GMOs. Is it safe? So how we communicate is important. The World Health Organization has this elaborate theory of communication. Policy should communicate to the public, should communicate with risk communication, with regulators, but in reality, it's the media who's driving risk perception, and it's instant. So we have to think to not only what to communicate, but when to communicate. When the risk is high, it may garner low media attention. At the same time, when the risk is very low, it may garner high media attention. So there's a disconnect on that. Thinking what to communicate is really important, and I think that's been said over and over again. There's certain language that turns people off, and as a scientist, this kind of breaks my heart, and it took me a while to wrap my head around it. But things like amount is minuscule, research shows it's safe, let us feed the world, keep prices low. If you say something is cheap in Europe, it denotes poor quality. Better for the environment. These are all things that studies have shown turn people off. There was a nice study, did anybody see that, in 2012 from the Ranchers Alliance? And it talked about messaging. And they did a focus group. They were looking at who was driving the conversation on the internet. And they found out a lot of this information. One of the things that we've learned is if you lead with the science, you may lose with the science. Because there is this disconnect with the audience now on the science. But, you know, we know that food doesn't have to be scary. And that what's in a name is important. Has anyone eaten Chinese gooseberries in the audience? Anyone? Is anybody a fan? Do you know what are Chinese gooseberries?
Kiwi fruit.
They are kiwi fruit. What's in a name? Kiwi fruit sounds so much more delicious. And by the way, this product, of course, if it was genetically engineered, would never be. Because some people it has potential allergens in it. But again, perception is important. What about pink slime? What is pink slime? Lean, finely textured beef. You remember when this hit the press all around the U.S., and people were like horrified. What is pink slime? It had a huge yuck factor just by the name. But we have to think, what does pink slime have in common with Belgium? 400 million. 400 million is the amount of waste that would be produced if leanly, finely textured beef was disposed of. About the same amount of food waste in Belgium. So are we talking food waste? That has value. People have values. They want to be sustainable. But pink slime? So there's a lot in a name. What do all of these have in common? Anyone? Well, they have everything, almost everything, because they all come from the mustard family. But if we were to tell people that, that's not important to them. It's important to them is it healthy? Is it safe? Is it high quality? In ag, we have so many disconnects, I think, with our audience because of this move to the urban environment. If we ask people about the seedless watermelon, they would be very surprised. How do you get a seedless watermelon? You treat it with colchicine. And you mutate it and double its chromosomes. And that's how you get a seedless watermelon. But that's not regulated and no one cares. But if it's a GMO, they care. And it's regulated. It's odd. Perception, risk. Risk in context. What do we care about? We're worried about terrorist attacks. We're worried about plane crashes. I get in a plane, I worry about a plane crash. But I really ought to be thinking about heart disease, where the risk is greater. So the difference between risk and perception is the difference between taking action and reaction. And I think in agriculture around the world, not just in the U.S., we see reaction. Pink slime, reaction. This is a study done in the UK, and if you ask people, if you say, if you were to have, let me say, eat meat from a cloned animal, how would you feel? They'll say one thing. Or if you were, how do you feel about genetically engineered food or GMOs? They'll say one thing. But if you ask them, you know, what you care most about, that won't be the top of their chart. They'll say things like, is the food safe? Or many other things. But the perception is different. So how you ask the question matters. In this study, when they looked at UK deaths related to diet, the number one thing was cancer and heart disease. But it's almost overwhelming to think about those. Maybe that's why in our risk perception framework, we don't. Science as a storyteller, we could replace this with producer as a storyteller, policymaker as a storyteller. Because that's when you connect. Those in the media know this well. They know how to connect to the audience. They know how to personalize the story, to acknowledge, to connect, and to build trust. I'll tell you a couple of stories about building trust. I was at an event where it was a dinner, and I was sitting next to two people who I knew from the groups they were with were very opposed to genetic engineering. And I thought, well, this is going to be a long night, and I want to have a good conversation, but where do we even begin? And sitting across from us was a scientist who was dealing with new breeding technologies, things like gene knockouts, which, by the way, is some work being done so that you can have cattle that don't have to be dehorned. So we're sitting there, and we're having this polite conversation, but in the back of my mind is, you know, this is a little awkward. And the guy right in front of us, who's the scientist, says, he orders something, and it gets us talking about food. And he said, yeah, I've been thinking about my diet, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing that. And we began to have this conversation about food, what matters, and we began talking about values. And all of a sudden, I realized that we were having the conversation that we needed to have. Because we started talking about genetic engineering and other things, but in a way that doesn't usually happen. We were building trust through another way and having that genuine conversation. Another example is on the labeling issue. So we have a voluntary labeling with genetic engineering in the U.S. Other countries have mandatory labeling, and you'll find less products on their shelves because industry in many places has remanufactured the products. Brazil is an interesting case. They have mandatory labeling where you'll have this little triangle on the package. And I was very interested in what happened with the public there. And so I reached out to one of the industry people in Brazil, and I said, when this happened, did the industry reformulate? And he said, no. And I said, did it matter to people? And he said, no. And I said, why is that? He said, because these were U.S. companies and people had trust in the brand. So trust is a really key element. And only then can we talk about the science. So finding ways to connect with this audience that's, I think, in a lot of ways wanting to connect to agriculture, but not having a way to do it. So this concept of peak child, now is the time that matters, it sure does. Because if we get it right and we can connect to these millennials, it can make all the difference. It can make difference for industry. It can make difference for us globally. There's a good news story to tell with agriculture, and we know it, right? We know we have the data to prove it. We need to just be able to connect. This is from the Global Harvest Initiative, and they talk about increasing sustainability through less inputs. We have a lot of good examples in agriculture to be able to show this. And so when we talk about a particular, I think what happens, we talk about a particular technique, people get caught up in that instead of thinking where we're really going with agriculture and where we're trying to go. And so finding a way to connect through sustainability is really important. My parting thought in this hot, interconnected world where social media drives everything. You may not be able to tweet common sense, but you can provide a link. And so we want to be able to connect, and so we have that opportunity. Rudy talked about providing, getting on Facebook. We need ag to have that personalized voice and connect.